Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Chandler Luebbert, and I'm with Black Diamond Mergers and Acquisitions. Today, I'm joined by our special guest, Dr. Tim Yeager, a former Federal Reserve official and a current banking instructor at the University of Arkansas. So, Dr. Yeager, thank you for coming today. I know I appreciate it, and I'm sure our audience will appreciate it as well.
Sure. Well, thank you, Chandler, for having me, and for Black Diamond for having me. I am happy to be here. And I would say that Chandler was a former student of mine, and I enjoyed having him in class. And he is on his way to great success.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's actually funny. We were talking before this about the Fed meeting today. Kind of wait to see what your thoughts were after our meeting before they make a decision. So it's kind of funny there.
Yeah, it's good timing. And it's just a few more hours until we might see the Fed raise interest rates. I think I heard on the radio it was the last time in 3 years that since they have raised interest rates. So this will be a different path for the Federal Reserve for quite some time, and for the economy.
Definitely. So let's just jump right in with some general information about yourself. Let our audience know a little bit about your background, your degrees, qualifications, prior work experience, and kind of what you're doing now.
Okay, so as I get older, my history gets longer. I earned my PhD at Washington University in St. Louis, which is where I grew up. I grew up in St. Louis. And right after graduate school, I had a teaching job up in way northern California, up in the Redwood country, actually. And I was there for a couple of years and loved it. It was a beautiful place with redwood trees growing in our backyard. It was just delightful, but was also way far away from our families. And so, and we had some young children. And so we moved, I had an opportunity actually to go to the St. Louis Federal Reserve. And there was an opening for an economist in the bank supervision unit there to do policy work and to do research on banking. And so my wife and I, with our 2 little children at the time, moved back to St. Louis. And I was working at the Federal Reserve from 1998 through 2005, but I really wanted to get back into academics. And so I learned a tremendous amount at the Federal Reserve about the banking system. And in fact, now that's what I teach, because I, in 2005, accepted a job as a finance professor here at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. And I have been there for 16 plus years and really have enjoyed it. And what's really nice about my Fed experience is that I was able to take so much of that and just transfer it right into the classroom. And so, I think the students can benefit from a perspective that is built on actually how the banking system works and how it's regulated.
Awesome, yeah. So very basic in general terms, what is the purpose of the Federal Reserve? What's the purpose of the FOMC, and how do they impact our economy?
So I would argue that the Federal Reserve is the most important entity in terms of how it affects the economy in our nation, far and away above any control that any president has, that President Biden has or President Trump had. They have relatively limited effects on the economy, and Congress has more through the budgetary process, spending and so on, taxation. But in terms of the quick and oftentimes powerful impact that the Federal Reserve can have on the economy, there's really no match to that. And when they change interest rates, for example, or conduct quantitative easing or other types of monetary policy, it will have an effect. And so what the Federal Reserve does, they do several things, but the 2 things that I would argue are the most important is they oversee the banking system and they oversee now the financial system. So they are in charge of financial stability overall. And then they also run or conduct monetary policy. And as probably most of the viewers know, this is their role of changing liquidity in the system and in the economy to primarily influence interest rates and therefore influence spending and indirectly anyway influencing employment and inflation.
So how does our current economic and financial situation that we have now compared to that of 2008 to 2015 when the Fed was in a sort of similar situation?
I would say, thankfully, that we are not in the same situation of, let's say, the latter half of 2007 and going into 2008. And even though, as I'll probably mention later, even though I do think we have several asset bubbles that have really built up in certain areas like equity and housing and other assets, it's not the same as it was in 2006, 2007, when we had a big surge in subprime housing. And the main difference is that the people who are buying the homes today, who are buying the stock and so on, can better absorb any losses that might occur if those prices fall. And so it's on a more sound footing, right? It's not based upon very high risk and speculative types of credit that we saw right before the financial crisis. On the other hand, we do have a huge challenge. And I think what's paradoxical is that the Federal Reserve has helped put us in this situation. And so I'll just say at the outset that I worked at the Federal Reserve. They are a wonderful organization, very professional, and they have high ethical and other standards. And yet, I think that the monetary policy has been misguided for about the last 6-7 years to some degree. And I think it has been way too aggressive, way too loose. And it has led us to a situation now where we do have a lot of debt that has built up. We do have some asset bubbles that are concerning. And it's going to be very, very difficult for the Fed to so-called walk this tightrope where it has to conduct monetary policy and not lead the economy into a recession. And I suspect that is not going to be possible. I suspect that, as history will show, that the raising interest rates, if they continue along that path, will lead us into a recession.
Okay, so when we're listening to the news, we hear all these buzzwords, and two in particular, I kind of want you to expand on are quantitative easing and quantitative tightening. Could you just elaborate on those and tell us how the Fed engages in those activities and what their overall purpose is to the markets and our economy?
Sure. So just to step back for a moment, the main way that the Federal Reserve conducts monetary policy is through what we call open market operations. And let's suppose that they're trying to speed up the economy. So what they do is they coordinate with the large banks, and this is already all set up in a very efficient process. And they put out orders to buy bonds, right? Usually treasuries or mortgage-backed securities. And so these banks sell bonds to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve literally on a keyboard types in the amount. Let's say they buy 100 billion in bonds, they type in $100 billion and they shoot it to the accounts of all these banks. And all of a sudden our economy has 100 billion more dollars in it than it did a second ago, right? So I've always told my students that's the coolest job in the world, is the one who is entering the numbers on the keyboard and then just creating the money out of nothing, right? And so now the banking system has a whole lot of money that it can lend. And so it starts to lend that money out, and that pushes down interest rates because they want to increase demand for that debt, right, for the borrowing of those funds. And so quantitative easing takes that monetary policy to an extreme intentionally. And so the Federal Reserve, instead of buying $10 billion in a typical maybe daily movement or over a week or something, they will start to buy $50 billion maybe every week or something along those lines. And the amounts are enormous. So between 2007 and 2022, the Federal Reserve holding of assets have increased from roughly 1 billion to 1 trillion to 9 trillion. And so we have had about 7-8 trillion of quantitative easing put in over that time. Now, I think a lot of that was justified. We needed a lot of that for to get through the financial crisis. But I think the mistake has been made of applying it so aggressively here in the last couple of years. And so what's the difference with quantitative easing and typical monetary policy? There's two things. First, as I mentioned, is just the volume of the transactions, right? The quantity of the bond purchases. And then secondly, usually the Federal Reserve is buying long-term bonds in quantitative easing, and they focus on the long-term maturities because they're trying to force down long-term interest rates. And what they want to do is get more spending and more consumption, more investment by people borrowing and businesses borrowing long-term rather than short-term, so that it stimulates much more investment in the economy.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I want to transition into interest rates. We know that the Fed's meeting today, and presumably they're going to raise interest rates 25 basis points. And we keep seeing multiple reports about the number of rate hikes expected for this year. Jamie Dimon of JPMorgan Chase said he expects about 7 to 10. Other Bloomberg analysts are saying anywhere from 6 to 4. What's kind of your expectation on how many rate hikes we can expect to see for this year and when they might come?
Well, so one thing you learn over the years is that you either give an event that predicted an event that's going to happen, or you give a timeline, but never both. Because economists are terrible at forecasting, right? And so yes, the Federal Reserve is going to raise rates, and they will raise rates multiple times. But as to how many and when, honestly, I think that's kind of a fool's errand to try to predict, because it was hard enough before we had the invasion of Ukraine. And now you add that into the mix, and it creates even more uncertainty, more volatility. And I think that it's going to be impossible to know really what the Federal Reserve is going to do beyond even, say, 6 months from now, or certainly a year or two from now. But I would expect that they will, in the next 6 months at least, probably raise rates 2 or 3 times.
Okay, and in the immediate term, after today's meeting, the Fed says they'll raise 25 basis points. What's the short-term effect of that interest rate hike, and then what's the long-term effect of it?
The short-term effect is not in financial markets. It's not going to be very strong, and it's because the Federal Reserve has been prepping the markets for the last really 20 years. They have been so careful at trying to prep the markets for what is going to come that it's rarely a surprise when the Federal Reserve changes interest rates on a given day and then announces those changes, because it's been so forecasted in other ways so that the markets understand what they're going to do. And today is no exception. So markets, the rates go up 25 basis points, and the markets say, okay, that's what we expected, right? So it's already kind of built in. And only when there are surprises do we see some volatility that occur in the market. But once again, just kind of coming back to this theme, I think that it is not desirable to always please the market so much, because what you do is you remove the risk. And when you remove the risk, then the speculators can get in and they can take big, bold bets on what's likely to happen, because the probability of being wrong is so low. And it drives up these asset prices again, and I think leads to much more volatility in those prices, and ultimately some financial instability.
So yeah, so for the average consumer or the average homeowner, what type of impact will these rate hikes have on them in particular?
Yeah, because I focused on the financial markets, right, in terms of the changes in the interest rates, but longer term, medium term and longer term, it translates into economic outcomes. And when interest rates start to move higher, 25 basis points may not do much, but when the rates start to move higher, then people say, well, it's getting more expensive to borrow. And I don't need to borrow so much. I don't need to buy that new car yet. I don't need to get the home equity loan to expand on my house. And so I don't need to use my credit card as much. I'm going to cut one of my cards up, so people talk like that. And so the spending slows. And of course, businesses have to borrow short-term and long-term debt regularly, right? And so that becomes more expensive. And so as debt becomes more expensive with the higher interest rates, then the demand for goods and services slows down, and it puts pressure on our economy to slow down as well. So just to tie that together, again, coming back to the way that the Fed has been so aggressive in the last few years, is that they have led the businesses and consumers to believe that interest rates are going to be low and they're going to stay low for a long period of time. And so I think a lot of us, my age, look at interest rates of 4% on mortgages and we say, oh my gosh, that's so low. But yet millennials and younger people say, look how horrible and high those mortgage rates are, right? And so they prep our consumers to have such low expectations for interest rates that when interest rates do start to return even a little bit more to normal, instead of being kind of a tap of the brake on the economy, it's going to really be more of a slam on the brakes for the economy, because people will look at those interest rates and say, yeah, well, I no longer need to buy that house. I'm not going to keep bidding for homes. I'm not going to buy stocks. I'm going to put the money more in bonds. And we might see some really big declines in some of those asset prices over time. Now, that doesn't all happen off a 1 quarter increase in interest rates, right? But it happens when perhaps the Federal Reserve has increased interest rates 8 or 10 times over a couple of years. And then just the other component that we really haven't talked about yet is inflation, right? And so we have inflation now that's running at about 8%. And the Federal Reserve, even now, openly admits it was behind the curve in fighting this inflation. And these inflation pressures are only increasing because two additional reasons, in addition to all the ones we already had, which one is the war in Ukraine, and therefore the more volatility in energy prices, right? And then China is starting to get a new wave of infections in Omicron, because they have tried to keep out the virus, and now it's starting to build up. And that means more supply disruptions, which means supply constraints, higher prices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a perfect segue, because that was actually my next question about inflation. So when we're measuring inflation, what variables are taken into consideration when we do calculate the inflation rate?
Well, the US government has been doing this for a long time. And what they do in the Bureau of Labor Statistics is that they look at a whole wide range basket of food and services that people normally consume, right? So what's sort of a typical expenditure pattern of most of our urban households? That's the one that is the main one that's tracked. And then they simply track those prices over time. And they send people out to grocery stores to write down prices. They send people out to the department stores actually to record prices. I would imagine these days more of it is being done even electronically, but nevertheless, they actually track the prices. And then there's a consumer price index, which then is built off of some base year, and then it just increases by whatever percent that the prices overall increase.
And the United States benchmark for inflation is 1 to 2%. historically. And like you just said, we're floating at about 7.98% right now with our inflation rate. So just to speculate, how long do you think it'll take for the US to drop back down to that 1 to 2% threshold or benchmark, I should say?
Well, it's going to take a while. It's going to take longer than we think, probably. And this is the real issue with, again, the Federal Reserve policy choices that they have right now. So I always ask my students, well, what should you do? Raise interest rates and risk a recession, or lower interest rates at this time to help ease with supply chain shortages and maybe oil shortages, and risk more inflation? And if you were the central banker, what would you do? Right? And then, of course, the right answer is you should just resign. And that's because there's no good answer, right? So you raise interest rates, then inflation falls, but yeah, you probably push your economy into a recession. If you lower interest rates, then maybe the economy does better, but you end up with even more inflation that you're going to have to deal with sometime in the future. And again, people my generation, we remember in the 1970s, early 1980s, that's exactly where we were at. And we are in a lot of that same situation right now. And there's no easy answers. It's a bad choice either way. I suspect that the Federal Reserve is, of course, going to hit inflation first. But if the economic damage seems to be too severe, they'll probably be pretty quick to back off.
So with inflation, the highest it's been since 1982, when it was at 6.16%, how can small business owners alleviate some of the financial burdens just doing business, whether it be the cost of goods right now or just paying their employees? What are some preventive measures they can take to kind of alleviate that financial burden?
Honestly, I think it would, it's context specific, but I think it's all about good management. And what you try to do is balance everything. You have all these pressures on your supply costs, right? So are there ways you can cut costs other ways to be more efficient? Do you need to hire more employees to be able to help you overcome some of those constraints and find additional suppliers? Do you need to not raise wages, for example, as much as you otherwise would have, because you're trying to hold your price down? Or do you raise prices? And ultimately, it just depends on what the situation is of each business. So it's a complicated answer. And again, there's really not a good outcome when you're facing this high inflation. But I do think that we need to understand that inflation will eventually come down, and it did come down. Even in the 80s, it came down very fast, from about 10% to 4% in a year, but at the cost of a deep recession.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the labor market, what do you expect to see going forward? Do you see, a full recovery, or do you see people kind of waiting to get back in to see what the markets do, or what's kind of your outlook on that?
This is another whole interesting area that we could have our whole discussion on in terms of the labor market. And the pandemic has really thrown a wrench in this. And I suspect that it's going to be hard for employers to hire people in the way that they used to before. And so that's going to be putting upward pressure still on wages. So in some sense, we still haven't seen that price spiral kick in on inflation. And I think that's coming next. And so employers say, workers say, look, inflation was 8%. I want an 8% raise or a 10% raise. But what if inflation falls really quickly down to 3%, right? And now these wages are much higher. So there's a whole lot of uncertainty that's going on now. And then if the economy does indeed start to slow down pretty quickly, then the supply of labor will increase. You'll have a little bit more unemployment. But right now we're at extremely low unemployment rates. And so in one sense, the economy, the labor force has recovered. In another sense, there's a whole lot of people who left the labor force and just are not coming back.
Right. So to wrap this all up, and then we can take some questions from the audience. For the overall outlook for 2022 and beyond, what's your personal, take on that? What do you think the economy is going to do in 5 years from now, 6 years from now? Where do you see us a decade from now with the decisions we make today?
This is going to be a tough year economically. This is going to be difficult to navigate through. And I suspect that if we don't end up in recession in this year, later in this year, we will start the path towards a recession this year. Inflation is not probably going to drop that much this year. And it's because the Federal Reserve is only beginning to increase inflation. And we still have those supply side pressures, and we still have high, relatively high energy prices. So I suspect that the Federal Reserve is only at the beginning stage of fighting inflation. And it's going to slow down the economy, probably not, maybe not to bid into recession yet, but inflation also is going to remain stubbornly high. That's my best forecast for what it's worth.
Well, awesome. Yeah, it's no better source than you. So it's good stuff. So if we have any questions from our audience, anyone want to ask Dr. Yeager a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.